Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half hour, we'll be seeing what's making the front pages of tomorrow's papers with chief leader writer at The Observer and former advisor to Ed Miliband, Sonia Sodha, and political journalist Isabel Oakeshott. So welcome to both of you. So let's check what's on those front pages then. And the Eye leads with President Trump's standoff with Mexico as tension between the two countries increases. Also focusing on Theresa May, or certainly focusing on Trump, Mrs May has buried Tony Blair's doctrine of liberal interventionism. That's the lead on the Financial Times. No more wars like Iraq, quotes the Daily Telegraph, as May pledges never to repeat the failed policies of Blair and Bush. The Times leads with the Prime Minister's announcement that the two nations must stand together. The Metro chooses to focus on that all-important so-called special relationship between the UK and US, calling the pair an odd couple. And Theresa May herself said today that opposites attract in her first speech in the US, and that's on the front of The Guardian. Pension payouts are boosted, says the Daily Express in their lead story. The Daily Mail are leading with hip operations, saying they'll be banned for people who are able to sleep. The late George Michael's body is still being held by police, according to the Daily Star. So let's chat through those stories then with Sonia Sodha and Isabel Oakeshott. And so an awful lot to talk about as regards Theresa May and Donald Trump. I think you've picked out The Guardian to start off with, and that quotation by Theresa May about her relationship with Donald Trump, saying, well, opposites attract.
Well, I mean, this was a relationship that didn't have the best of starts, did it? You know, Donald Trump was irritated that Theresa May didn't find some kind of role for his great friend Nigel Farage, and she just wasn't prepared to accommodate Donald Trump's very vocal request for Nigel Farage to be given a position. And I think there has been a kind of, mutual, if not suspicion, certainly there's some circumspection between the two. And so she's got some ground to make up, I think. But on the other hand, she's not going to be his poodle. And I think this was quite a clever phrase there, that opposites attract, because really it's hard to imagine two politicians who could be more different than Theresa May and Donald Trump.
And presume she has to tread a fine line. On the one hand, she's talking about opposites attract, i.e. we can be close together, we can do a good trade deal, but at the same time trying to make out I'm very different from him and we may not agree on everything. Do you think that she's managed to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, she got asked a question, didn't she? And she had to give an answer, and as answers go, opposites can attract, opposites attract. As you say, it kind of, I think she's trying to communicate both. She wants a close relationship with America, but there are real areas of difference, for example, like on NATO. I have to say, I actually really feel for her, because I think, this is probably the biggest diplomatic challenge that any Prime Minister has faced over the last kind of 20 or 30 years. She's got to tread an incredibly fine line between, Britain, obviously, in a Brexit world, needs a trade deal with America, for example. We've always been very close allies. We've had the special relationship. So, we need to sort of keep that relationship going. But then at the same time, there are some very tough truths that Theresa May needs to deliver to Trump. His comments on torture today, for example, the things that he said about NATO, his attitudes to Russia and to Putin.
I mean, interestingly, she actually agreed with him on NATO in the speech tonight. So she has Trump's essential position on NATO. He has said he thinks it's obsolete. I don't think he actually means the word obsolete. I think he means that it needs reform. And his real beef with it is that so few member states actually contribute the required amount. So America pays disproportionately. Britain is also one of the ones that pays a huge amount into NATO. And she's actually agreed with them on that this evening.
Except if you say that I think that's a very generous view of Donald Trump, though, and his view on NATO. I think he genuinely does think that it's obsolete. I don't think it's just about.
I do, and I think.
I do, and I think.
Well, look at the Defence Secretary that he's
Yes,
appointed.
that's true.
And their views would be so miles asunder on that if he really was adamant that it was obsolete. You know, it's quite clear that Mattis has no intention of kind of dismantling NATO.
Her speech is very interesting, though. So I think it was quite self-contradictory in some ways. So on the one hand,
I agree with you on that.
Yeah. Wow.
We actually agree on that one.
Should we just pause for a moment?
It's
now
almost,
continue.
don't you think it's almost as if, you know, people will read into it what they want to hear. It's quite clever in that way because you hear what you want to hear. So if you want to hear that Britain isn't going to anymore go into misplaced foreign interventions.
And the era
like
of
Iraq.
intervention
but
is
on
over.
the other hand, if you actually look at the whole speech, she says, well, we can't allow Russia to just do what it wants to do. You know, there are plenty of things that on the other side.
Well, let's just bring in that angle of the speech as well, because the Financial Times picks up on it, and I think the Telegraph does as well as their main story. This sense that there'll be no more wars like in Iraq, a kind of rejection of the Bush and Blair era. And the Telegraph actually, I think, in its first paragraph says it hails it as the biggest shift in UK foreign policy for more than 20 years.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Tony Blair, when he sort of set out his foreign policy doctrine, he went and did it in Chicago and gave a very sort of, you know, a speech that really went down in history as defining UK foreign policy for the next 10 to 15 years. And it feels like May is sort of trying to mirror him in some sense by going to the States and setting out her sort of foreign policy doctrine. But I mean, I only had time to sort of very quickly skim the speech before coming on here tonight, but I think there are some really notable things about it. So for example, you know, this idea that we only intervened in Iraq and Afghanistan because that was about Britain trying to remake the world in its image. I think that's a very simplistic view of the justification at the time for intervention. And certainly when you look at Afghanistan, for example, people were arguing at the time that it's been incredibly problematic and there have been massive issues, but people were arguing at the time, well, that is in Britain's interest. And so on the other hand, May is saying, well, we should intervene when it's in Britain's interest. The other thing that's really concerning to me in the speech, and I think maybe it marks a very depressing shift in sort of, you know, in the international order, is she did not mention, as far as I could see, you know, the UN responsibility to protect, which was something that was actually, you know, something that Blair, for example, really pushed with the UN.
I think she did at least talk about the need to support institutions like the UN as well as NATO.
I mean, in a way, this whole speech is classic May. It's sort of classic on the one hand, but on the other. You know, this is a woman who was a Remainer, but has managed to convincingly, and I really believe it's not an artifice, you know, she has turned herself into a full-blooded Brexiteer. And then you've got this speech where on the one hand she's saying no more, you know, end of the kind of era of interventions like Iraq and Afghanistan, but on the other hand we must still intervene where it's in our interest. And as Sonia says, well, almost everything's in our interest these days because this is a very small world.
And the other issue that also highlights the difficulty Theresa May faces is covered on the front page of the Eye, Mexican standoff, because there a bit of a row going on, as you might not be too surprised, between Donald Trump and the Mexican
Massive
president,
row,
who has cancelled a trip now over the building of the Mexican wall. But the whole issue of trade and the difficulties that Theresa May faces in striking a trade deal are kind of also illustrated by this as well.
Yeah, I mean, where do you begin with her problems? You've also got the minor issue of his stance on torture. I mean, that is, I think, much more problematic, really, than the Mexican standoff. I think the Mexican standoff is massively problematic in the sense that it shows that Trump is not rational when it comes to his foreign policy, and he makes kind of decisions in a very sort of rash way. Not rational? Well, I think the wall is very rational.
Well, because
I'm quite in favour of the wall.
Because Mexico is actually a key ally for the United States. I mean, the way that Donald Trump has talked about Mexico in the past, forcing them to pay for the wall, it's now come out today.
But it's also
his press secretary said they might put a 20% tax on
and that's
Mexican
what I'm talking
imports.
about, the trade deal being difficult.
Yeah, and actually that is completely against
him
America. But it's completely against America's economic interests. Mexico is one of its key trading partners. It does way more trade with Mexico than it does with the UK. And what's not to say that at some point Trump won't turn around and say, well, we'll slap a 20% import tax on British imports.
OK, and answer Isabel's point there, that it was one of the reasons potentially why people voted for Donald Trump. So
you might not like it, but that's on the basis that he won the election. That was one of his absolute flagship things. So he can't now go, well, actually, I'm not building the wall. I'll just put a minor little fence up and maybe, you know, post a few extra guards.
He could have very much temper what he said during the election, and
then
that's
he'd
what
be
lots of
accused of
people
not
expected
keeping
him
promises.
to do.
So.
OK, well, shall we move on to another subject? It's actually still on the front of the Eye that obviously there's more coverage inside, but they are flagging up the issue over the Brexit vote, the Article 50 bill that was released today, and Jeremy Corbyn is putting a 3-line whip on his Labour MPs to back it, to make sure that it goes through.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at any other time this wouldn't be a great deal, really. You know, this is a very new MP that has resigned from the front bench. Not in normal scheme of things, a brand new MP who just won a very marginal seat would not be propelled to the front bench anyway. And now she's having a kind of flouncing out hissy fit because she might have to support Brexit. I know her constituency. Sonia's going to come in here and say that she's, you know, standing up for her constituents. But what exactly is she going to achieve?
Well, I just don't think
Absolutely
it's quite
square root
fair to
of
talk
nothing.
about this as a flounce, but I do think this is an interesting story in the sense that I mean, the last 2 or 3 days have really highlighted highlighted just what a mess Labour is in over Brexit. Still don't really have a clear position, incredibly divided as a party. You've got some MPs who really want to support Article 50, particularly those who sort of represent leading areas. And you've got some MPs on the front bench, you know, Tulip Siddiq has just resigned, who want to vote against it.
And her constituency voted firmly in favour of Remain.
There isn't really a clear position. And I think some of the one of the reasons why Corbyn came out and said he was going to put a 3-line whip on this was that the Labour MPs had a presentation from their new pollster yesterday evening, and it delivered some really tough truths, I think, to Labour about...
Did they need the presentation to realise those truths?
I mean, fair point. But I mean, there's just so much evidence out there at the moment for how Labour is in a real mess with its electorate, with its voters. People don't know what it stands for on Brexit.
Actually, the point is she is in it's a 3-way marginal, that seat.
Yeah.
What's it called? Is it...
Hampstead and Kilburn?
Yeah, so it's sort of very London-y, very marginal seat. I mean, she's
75% Remain.
Yeah. Yes, so, I mean, this is probably an MP who, quite understandably, is trying to hold on to that seat at the next election. The debate is going to go on at least until then, so it's positioning.
OK, we're going to take a break. Lots to talk about after the break, though, including a mother wins the right to fight an abortion law. That's coming up. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, political journalist Isabel Oakeshott and former advisor to Ed Miliband, now chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodha. So let's take a look at The Guardian, because you've picked out the story. We've talked about Theresa May. You want to talk about the story on the right-hand side of that. A mother given permission to fight Ulster abortion law.
And this feels like a bit of a heartbreaking story. So abortion law is very different in Northern Ireland. You know, the abortion law that applies to the rest of the UK doesn't apply there. So abortions are only available in very extreme circumstances. So this is a case of a 15-year-old girl who got pregnant. Quite commonly over there, you will have to try and procure abortion drugs over the internet, which is against the law, because otherwise women have to travel over to the UK for an abortion. And of course, if you're 15, that's incredibly difficult. And this is a case, there's a question over whether her mother, who helped procure those drugs for her, which, you know, any mother would do in that situation, or a lot of mothers would, whether she will actually face prosecution, and she could actually face a jail sentence. So this is about that case, and there are other things about the case, I think. So, for example, the girl went to her GP about, you know, some complications or to get advice after she'd taken the drugs, and the GP reported her to the police, and her medical records were accessed by the police, which I think is incredibly dodgy, and there's a legal question over that.
I mean, it is
I just think it highlights how
story, isn't it?
Exactly,
I mean, Sonia and I are
how backwards the abortion laws are.
We're kind of on completely different sides of the abortion debate. I'm not completely anti-abortion, but I would be massively in favour of completely reducing the time limit down to 12 weeks. But even I, as a kind of, you know, anti-abortionist, really do not think that this feels right at all to me. You know, it is just so draconian. On a human level, how can it possibly be right that a 15-year-old girl is in the position of having inadvertently kind of drawn her mother into this horrendous legal complication? And
the idea you go to the doctor and you get shopped to the police, it's just absolutely shocking, and it puts women in Northern Ireland in such a difficult, awful, horrible position.
OK, we're going to move on to another health-related story. The front of the Daily Mail says that you won't be able to get a hip op if you can sleep, presumably meaning if you're not in so much pain that you can't sleep.
Obviously now everybody knows this. They're all going to tell their doctors that they can't sleep. So it's kind of
Isabel spotted the flaw in the NHS's rationing plan.
Yeah. And also, interestingly, I mean, they're introducing an element of patient responsibility. So some trusts are now saying you've got to, if you're obese, you've got to lose a certain amount of your body weight before we're going to go ahead. I know Sonia disagrees on this. She is going to stand up for obese people as well.
Yeah, too right I am.
I really am not, because I think you can't. You have to have some reality about the NHS, Sonia, and I know you are absolutely in cloud cuckoo land when it comes to the NHS.
I am not in cloud cuckoo land.
You can just keep on throwing money at it.
No, I don't think that you can
but
just...
reality kicks in.
I don't think that you can just... But the fact is, Isabel, in 2018, per capita funding for the NHS is actually going down. We are an advanced democracy. We should be spending more on our healthcare.
We're
spending really
highfalutin here.
This is not highfalutin, and actually, I have to say, this is all about rationing. This is a sign of the financial difficulties facing the NHS. It hasn't seen the historic year-on-year rises that it has over the last kind of 50, 60 years since it was created. And I think, you know, if you're saying to somebody who's obese it's actually not safe to do the surgery on you because you're too fat for the surgery. That is one thing. Yeah. But here, it sounds like it's actually about rationing for financial reasons. I'm sorry, but it is inhumane to leave somebody who's obese in acute hip and knee pain.
They've probably got a sore knee because they're fat. They're too fat.
Oh my God, I can't believe you just said that.
They probably do. That's just a reality, Sonia. If you're overweight, you are going to put an awful lot of pressure on your joints.
Yes, that's true, but once your joint has gone, you might need it replaced.
Yeah, and just this is not necessarily new policy, is it? This article says it's 3 health trusts who are drastically tightening their rules in the hope of slashing the number of operations.
I think it's a sign of more. I think we will see more of this to come, Anna. So yes, it's 3 health trusts.
Well, if it means people have to take a bit more responsibility, then, because just to go back to your point, you know, if you carry on doing the operation because they're fat and they're in pain, all that's going to happen is that the new hip's going to be in pain because they're still too overweight.
I just don't think it works like that.
You've gone all quiet. You've got
OK,
no
and
answer.
that story, I think, also makes it to the front of the Times, just on the right-hand side there. But to end up with, we're going to talk tomatoes. Something completely different. This is inside the Mail. I think it's from the Mail. Yes, it is. And it's about putting the taste back in tomatoes. Had you noticed that the taste had gone from tomatoes?
We've all had tasteless tomato, but it's I mean, it's not a unique problem to tomatoes, is it? You sometimes get
putting them in the fridge makes... No, I think actually it is quite a big problem.
It's a tomato
from experience. There is a real tomato issue, but it's one that people can actually take some action around. So if you put your tomatoes in the fridge, obviously they lose flavour. So
you say that obviously. I didn't know that.
Didn't you?
No,
really? So basically the cold affects, I've read about this, it affects the chemical that gives tomatoes flavour.
I've been going
So once they're refrigerated, even if they're refrigerated for sort of a day, 24 hours or so, I think, even if you take them out after that, they don't get their flavour back. So that is a really important tip
cheap and not
for tomato fans out there.
Cheap and not very ripe tomatoes, taste of nothing. They're just like eating
and they
cold
taste so
crunch.
incredible in the Mediterranean. It's because they pick them at the right sort of...
So what this article says, for tomatoes have dramatically lost their flavour in the last 50 years. Scientists have said it, so it must be true. But there is hope. They're now working on bringing tomatoes back to their former glory by clever breeding techniques, and modern versions of the fruit are created twice the size, which makes them less sweet, and they're working on...
I'm very excited about this. I think it's going to be great.
Are terrible, aren't they? I just want a quick shout out for tomatoes from the Isle of Wight. They are amazing. Better than any of these Italian stuff, you know, just
so
go
I've got
Isle
2 top tips on my tomatoes.
We'll
Thank you both very much indeed. We are out of time, but we are going to see you again at 11:30, aren't we? Sonia and Isabel, thanks very much indeed.